There seems to be a great deal of similarity between how we understand, or rather how we conceptualize knowledge and how we conceptualize consciousness. In both cases, we tend to adopt a metaphor involving some kind of a space. In consciousness, it's the space of mind. In the case of knowledge, it's slightly more ambiguous, but knowledge seems to be scattered across a terrain. Objects of knowledge seem to exist in some kind of a landscape, some kind of a spatially extended environment. I've already spoken about the way that different types of knowledge orient themselves or spread themselves across that space, drawing on entailments of the spatial metaphor, in which one feels oneself to be standing at the centre of a space, and the objects which are at some distance are conceptualized as objective, and the subject of visual metaphors, and those which are considered closer are considered to be subjective and tend to be explicated using tactile metaphors. We talk about felt knowledge or sensuous knowledge, for example. Or we occasionally use words like taste to indicate that the object of knowledge is so close to us, it's actually inside the body and highly subjective. So both the spatial metaphor for knowledge and the spatial metaphor for consciousness both have this idea of a space. Consciousness exists in a kind of space too. And like knowledge, we conceive of the space of consciousness and the object of consciousness as being somehow discrete, as being separate entities. And I think in terms of consciousness, there is some evidence for that. It is a tenet of, for example, Buddhism and many other contemplative practices, that there is such a thing as consciousness without object. But I think recently some studies of patients who have are either in coma or in some kind of vegetative state, not persistent or permanent vegetative state, but some kind of vegetative state. There seems to be some indication there that in some cases they have consciousness without any content. The reverse is obviously true. Many times we do have contents of mind without being conscious of those. So all non-conscious processing involves that. But the opposite does seem to be the case. We do seem to be able to have consciousness without there being any contents of consciousness. Or to continue with this spatial metaphor, there does seem to be, within our understanding of consciousness, this entailment of consciousness existing in a space, and then the contents of consciousness, the things we are actually aware of, existing as objects within that space. Also, similarly to knowledge, there's an overlap with the knowing is seeing metaphor, which implies the existence of light, because light is an inevitable part of seeing and is absolute fundamental requirement for seeing and visual awareness to take place. That's also very prominent in consciousness, in our understandings of consciousness, the extension of that spatial metaphor. So we imagine consciousness not only as a space, but as a brightly lit space. In fact, many times we talk about consciousness as being a kind of light, and enhancements of consciousness, or slightly modified versions of consciousness, as being modifications of the intensity or the placement of that light. So, for example, creativity, moments of creativity we imagine as flashbulb moments, as if the light has suddenly grown brighter. We also imagine the decline of consciousness towards sleep as a movement into darkness, and of course the great movement into darkness of death. We also imagine, possibly as Dylan Thomas put it, as a dying of the light to which we might not go gladly or quietly. So both consciousness and knowledge seem to be using this metaphor of space, and the entailment of that metaphor is that the space and the contents of that space, the objects of consciousness, the objects of knowledge, are separate, and this space is illuminated in some way. The intensity of the illumination or the variation of the illumination implies different types of consciousness and possibly different types of knowledge.